Hi guys, here we are. Coffee and comic books are two favorite things to do. This is Mike Al and Punisher Max from the Comic Book Syndicate. We're here today to talk about one of the most famous X-Men stories. It's called X-Men Days of Future Past. First published in 1980, it formed the basis for many cartoon adaptations and has most recently been adapted into the movie, as you know. Written by Chris Claremont, drawn by John Byrne, from a plot by John Byrne, which years later we have discovered as apparently lifted from a plot of Doctor Who.
These X-Men stories, or Days of Future Past, kind of personify like everything that I have an issue with the storytelling of that decade.
Sure.
Okay, so the story is very, very cool. I'll say that. It is a very cool idea.
Well, to give a brief summary, it's a bit like the Terminator, where we are introduced to a dystopian future where North America is ruled by these robots called Sentinels, who have killed or are trying to kill all mutants. And at this point, there's a small band of renegades led by
Magneto, yeah, who I could see why this was just so mind-blowing, because when we flash forward to the future, we see Magneto, and he's in a wheelchair, and he's working alongside,
Wolverine, Colossus Storm, and Kate Pryde.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
And Rachel Summers.
Right.
Who we won't say who that is just yet in case you haven't read it. Now, it is a great idea, and I'm sure that, if you're reading this in 1980, it was quite a shock to see this dystopian future. So they come up with this plan. We're going to send Kate Pryde's mind back in time to when she was young, and she was called Kitty Pryde. She's going to enter into her old body and help the X-Men prevent the assassination of Senator Kelly, because the assassination of Senator Kelly is what starts the chain of events which leads to this dystopian future.
It's the linchpin that leads to the Sentinel program and like the mutant internment camps that we saw at the beginning of the book.
Okay, so we have a great setup, but then what happens is things go right off the rails, in my opinion, the moment they send Kate Pryde back in time, and I'll tell you why. We flash back to the present day to a training sequence with the X-Men. Now, when the scene opens, I thought, oh, Kate Pryde is now back in the mind of Kitty Pryde. But no, she's not. It takes about 5 pages of Danger Room training before we finally link up with the other plot. So basically, on one hand, you have a lot of time wasted. You could say, oh, we have to establish what the characters are doing and all that. But does it really take 5 pages or whatever it was?
Yeah, and then she has this sort of like aneurysm thing where she falls on the ground, and that's when the minds link up. And it's so strange that you're right. It doesn't take 5 pages to do this.
No, it shouldn't. Essentially, the plot is not advanced for those pages. Nothing happens for those pages. And so it essentially becomes filler. So now you have what would have been a 1-issue story now turns into a 2-issue story.
Going into the second issue, there's a weird scene where they're fighting Sentinels, but it doesn't really mean anything because nothing really happens.
Well, and what's funny is that in the present day, Kate Pryde is sort of thinking to herself, I wonder what's going on in, oh, by the way, the future is 2013.
Yeah.
So she goes, I wonder what's going on in 2013. And then we flash forward to 2013. But what Chris Claremont doesn't realize is that you can't really have 2 concurrent stories going on when one takes place in the future. It's like they don't affect each, you know what I mean?
Right, I know, but this was addressed in the movie very well, where they don't touch up on this at all in the comic, and I feel like Chris Claremont didn't even think about it, but where time runs at the same time, so the future and the past, 5 minutes are the same.
Yeah.
But it really is not well described.
It falls apart very easily because at one point they're like, oh yeah, we're going to send Kate Pryde into the past to change everything. And then later on someone goes, actually, we have no idea what's going to happen. She might just create a parallel reality and we might just continue. And they're like, oh crap, we didn't think of that. But it's like, if you think about this, their plan, and this is also the plot hole of Terminator, is if the plan succeeds, we won't exist. We won't even, either we'll continue to exist and won't know it succeeded in creating a parallel timeline, or we'll cease to exist. But the fact that we're still here having these conversations means it didn't work. Because the moment it works, the whole timeline is affected. So the moment she leaves is when you should know if it worked. Because when is now? Oh, it worked. But why is it only affecting us now when it happened 40 years ago? You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's the problem with any time travel story. I mean, people kind of have to stop doing them.
You know what? Let's not even dwell on that. Let's just dwell on the actual plot. In the second issue, the X-Men fight to prevent Senator Kelly's assassination. They have, again, a 5 to 10 page fight with the new Brotherhood of Evil Mutants where the actual plot is not advanced. It's just fight scene, fight scene, fight scene. Typical 80s superhero stuff. What did you think about that?
I always like a good action movie, but in comic books, it kills me. You know, if I bought this, I wish I could have returned it, you know?
What do you think about the art of John Byrne?
Honestly, the art is probably what kept me reading, you know? It was the way that the Sentinels were drawn, and even though the action sequences were drawn out, they were drawn very well. I guess the sequencing of panels was just a little bit off. It was labored. I felt labored reading this, where it was kind of something that could be one or possibly 2 panels turned into 2 or 3 panels.
Good point. Well, you know what? I grew up with John Byrne, and at one point he was my favorite artist. At one point I had nearly everything he did in the 80s. And then one day, you know how when you stare at those dots and then like a sailboat kind of pops into focus? It was the opposite. I stared at John Byrne's art long enough that it popped out of focus, and I realized there was nothing really there, and I don't actually think John Byrne can draw that well at all.
Oh, really?
I think his anatomy is terrible, inconsistent. I just don't think he's ever advanced since the X-Men. He's gotten maybe a little bit better, but really, he's one of these comic book artists that becomes more refined in their own style rather than learning how to draw realistically better.
I mean, I haven't stared at it long enough to say that. So I think I have got like the Mike's younger like eyes like looking at it like, oh, this is really pretty. But I don't know, the sailboat hasn't popped out of focus for me yet.
I'll give him credit. He's very meticulous in his layouts, and he's been credited for being a good storyteller. I'll give him that. I just don't think his anatomy's good. I don't think he's good at, what's it called?
Like
Perspective.
like perspective angles, yeah.
Perspective is terrible. Anatomy's terrible.
Yeah, certain panels really popped, you know, but whenever he tried to do some sort of like bird's eye looking down, it just felt really flat and weird.
You know, I grew up on the X-Men, and I loved the X-Men as a teenager. But once I got into my 20s and I went back and reread these classic X-Men stories, I really found them they just can't hold up to, you know, people harp on the 90s. There was a lot of great 90s comics like Doom Patrol, Animal Man, Sandman, stuff like that. And when you go back and then reread these X-Men comics, this was the most popular comic of the 80s. These are not good comics. They're good for the day, but by any other standard, they are not good comics.
Exactly.
What do you think?
Like you have to put the sort of, okay, this was published, then I got to think about what was out around that time, and then this story would have been amazing, you know? But it doesn't hold up to today's standards.
No.
Not even the 90s standards.
No.
Like you said, Animal Man, Preacher, and all those. But as far as X-Men stories goes, even Brian Michael Bendis is doing a better job, in my opinion, with all new X-Men.
Well, I think what happened here is you have creators who were not necessarily the greatest writer or the greatest artist, but they were at the creative peak. They did have some decent ideas, maybe ideas that weren't necessarily being done in other titles. And so for that reason, the comic was really popular. But other people that have come along since then, like Grant Morrison, Joss Whedon, Brian K. Vaughan, Robert Kirkman, they've written X-Men. Those X-Men stories hold up much better than these do, even if they aren't quite as original. I could never hand this to a non-comics reader and use it as something to get them hooked on comics. There's no way.
No, yeah, there really isn't. If you want to get into comics, kind of start with something a little bit newer because it's a lot more reader-friendly. You know, this thing has a lot of backstory. Like, it references a lot of things that aren't in these issues and that happened, you know, in X-Men 120 or whatever. And it's just the kind of thing where if I were a new reader and this is the first thing I read, this would turn me away from comics.
Yeah. And to be fair, don't get us wrong. We're not saying that all comics from that time period are not good. There were a lot of good comics.
It's strange. Chris Claremont's X-Men, it always has a great idea.
Yes.
You know? And that's kind of what makes these comics enjoyable, but just not really worth the time.
So there you go. X-Men Days of Future Past.